areas of focus for the 2020s regarding youth development in Africa as espoused by Agenda 2063. So for today's session, we have a wide range of experts who have written and done research about key issues that encompass youth development. It is things such as youth participation in Africa, what ails the young, youth and peace and security, youth in nuclear, education, employment and entrepreneurship, and intergenerational engagement and co-leadership. So just to kickstart our session for today, we are going to start with our opening remarks. To explain how the webinar will go is that we will have two sessions. After each session, we will open up for an interactive session where you will have the opportunity to interact with our panelists, to ask them questions, and also to get your voices heard and give us your key comments. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Ms. Prudence Ngwenya from the African Union Commission. She is the head of the Youth Division.
Thank you very much, Itumeleng. I should probably start by declaring I'm really, really excited to be here, but also I'm much more excited to see Itumeleng moderating this session. She's a very good friend of mine. I don't know why she didn't say that. When I saw her face, I almost asked her, when are you coming to visit? So to me, great to see you, but I'm really excited as well to be here and to see everybody else. Warm greetings to everyone here today, and I'm really honored for the opportunity to speak to you today and to be invited in this gathering, which promises to be very exciting. I want to start by appreciating the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAI, for organizing this webinar and for extending the invitation to the Africa Union Commission Youth Division. I want to also applaud SAI on the recent report that highlighted youth participation in policy development. The recommendations and key outcomes really shed a light on the importance of education, capacity building, redefining meaningful youth engagement, and engaging young people as stakeholders. I really implore all of you to get some time and actually read, dig into that report. It's really, really interesting. Convening this is all an important conversation, and all important conversation on youth development is an indication of the Institute that SAI's commitment to implementing these recommendations and ensuring that young people actively participate in Africa's development. And as the Africa Union Commission, specifically the Youth Division, we really are happy with that. And we really, really want to encourage SAI for doing that and look forward to even working with you on this specific agenda. The topic of youth development and advocacy in the 2020s is one that is not only central to our work at the African Union Commission, but it's also very close to my heart personally. It is our ethos in the work of the Youth Division that if a critical mass of young people are engaged in the development agenda, and we will see gains, as a continent we'll see gains, and initiatives continent-wide will be scaled up for maximum impact. I'm sure you all are familiar with Agenda 2063, specifically the Aspiration 6, which speaks to unleashing the potential of young people. And we really encourage this for maximum impact of the things that we're doing. What is clear is that advocacy by nature is complex and very hard to measure. Therefore, strategies must be multi-pronged and flexible as the environment changes and new information is presented. This multi-pronged approach for us looks like regular consulting with young people to identify their priority areas so we can design policy that responds to those needs and the young people's needs. Young people have also demonstrated resilience and ingenuity despite challenges posed by COVID. And providing opportunities for young people across the continent in 2020 is now becoming even more important. At the AUC in 2020, we initiated our weekly online conversation series to keep young people engaged and connected in addressing critical issues affecting the continent, and as well as at that point, the coronavirus or COVID-19. As a division, we are committed to achieving Africa's youth development agenda by ensuring that young people are key players in Africa's development. His Excellency, the Chairperson, in 2019 launched the 1 Million by 2021 initiative to really catalyze action for youth development and provide 1 million opportunities through what we call the 4 E's. Education, entrepreneurship, employment, and engagement. The chairperson also appointed the first youth envoy, a young African lady who really worked so hard in pushing reforms and ensuring that young people occupy positions that matter. We are building a critical mass of young people who are empowered and equipped to solve 21st century skills through the AUC Youth Engagement and Leadership Framework. And it focuses on 4 A's, which is one of the things that I want to leave with you. As young people on this call, I want all of you to embrace the 4 A's idea, which is attitude, aptitude, awareness, and action. Wherever you are and whatever spaces that you occupy, make sure that you have the right attitude. You continuously seek to improve yourself and give yourself the right aptitude, but you're also aware of your environment and you're action-oriented, really ready to launch into action. We implement several programs around the 4 E's on education, employment, entrepreneurship, and youth engagement. And I'm sure some of you have seen some of the things that we do online. Our youth development programs are delivered through what we call our youth engagement strategy, which is MOCA, M-O-C-A. We mobilize, we orient or train, we lead conversations, which is the C, and then we activate young people to do things in their own communities. We also have the Africa Union Youth Volunteer Corps program, which has made significant impact on the continent. 2 weeks ago, we successfully trained 250 young people who are going to be part of the program. And it's really, again, nice to see Tumi here, who was one of our African young professionals through the volunteer program and who worked at the Africa Union Commission. These are some of the examples on how we provide spaces for young people to meaningfully engage with their communities and nurture their ideas. They also learn, they solve problems, they activate to impact their communities. These strategies and programs reflect our commitment to strengthen the relationship between young people and the Africa Union Commission, as well as encourage young people to take the lead in Africa's development. I want you to know that, and I want to leave you with the knowledge that we are a continent of young people with an impressive pool of talent and creativity, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. My challenge to every young person here is put this creativity and talent to use for the good of your community. It is time for young people to shape the future of the Africa we want. I thank you very much. Over to you, Tumi.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Prudence, and thank you for all the work that the AUC, particularly the Youth Division, continues to do on the African continent to drive active participation amongst young people and to drive meaningful engagement with young people. Our next speaker who is going to be doing our opening remarks is Mr. Kenneth Diole. He is a youth development expert and particularly forms part of SIRE's National Council.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Tawil, and thank you for having me. I'm truly grateful for the invitation. I must start with 3 disclaimers. I think firstly, I don't have a presentation. I don't know if that was expected because I think, like most of you, we're quite fatigued of all of the online presentations. I'd like to, keep you captured by also seeing what is happening. Number 2, though I'm grateful for the title of expert, I think I'm more of a practitioner. I think it takes quite a lot to be termed an expert in this space. And then number 3, is really to say, I saw that you guys used my university picture. People will think that my glory days are past, so I do have new professional pictures I can share from that perspective. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to cover 3 things, hopefully in the next 10 minutes or so. Number 1, I intend to hopefully set the scene at a global, continental, and national level. Number 2, to really speak around some of the emerging challenges as research provides, but also in my line of work that we're seeing. And hopefully at the end to provide some sort of perspective of how we can tackle some of these issues in the 2020s. So firstly, I think at a global level, as of March 2021, we have seen high unemployment rates, and I think that will be some of the key thematic point, right? So outside of Africa, Spain saw 37.7% youth unemployment in the European Union, followed by Greece, which has been suffering also from chronic unemployment in the youth segment, at 34.2%, and Italy at 33.3%. All this together also made sure that the International Labour Organization also said that there are about 64 million young people currently between the ages of 15 to 24 who are not employed. And I think it's important to recognize that I think in the context of South Africa and Africa, as guided by the African Youth Charter, we look at youth from 15 to 34 instead of 24. But also I think what has been an interesting revelation for me is really recognizing at a global level that there is, in most places, a direct correlation between economic growth and decline in youth unemployment in most other economies, with the exception of South Africa and most other African countries at large. And that's to say that I think the notion that a growing economy will necessarily make sure that youth unemployment is reduced is not necessarily true. There are fundamentally more systemic and structural challenges that are in place in many parts of this continent that we call home. At a continental level, we speak a lot around the demographic dividend. I believe it's the United Nations Developmental Program, among other UN entities and organizations that spoke about the demographic dividend. And for me recently, I've found myself thinking that we're looking more like a tragedy than a dividend. If we look at some of the key metrics that we need to achieve for us to be able to achieve a demographic dividend, we're not achieving them. Whether you look at the SDGs and in particular goals that look at poverty and education levels, whether you look at the Agenda 2063 and some of the guidelines that are provided by the African Union through the African Youth Charter in particular, we're not meeting a lot of those metrics. And for me, that's a cause to concern, because when you look at the African continent, we have an average age. The average African is 19.7 years old, with over 420 million Africans considered youth between the ages of 15 and 34. I think what I also find fascinating is that pre-COVID, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa, but that did not always translate into meaningful employment as well as empowerment for young people in particular, and especially young women. For an example, when you took a country like Morocco, which is currently positioned as one of the gateway economies into the continent of Africa, it is currently seeing, and this is pre-COVID, it had an 11.9% unemployment rate, but specifically in the youth segment, 31.2%, and graduates were not faring any better. They had an 18.7%. And I think a key element that I also want to emphasize, I think in his opening remarks, is the fact that not only are we seeing chronic unemployment among young people, we're seeing underemployment in that particular segment increasing. So that is the notion that you might be employed, but you are not necessarily gainfully employed. So there's an increase in what we call in-work poverty that is happening at a very rapid rate for young people across various sectors, not only in South Africa, but across many other sectors in the continent. And then we come down home here to South Africa. And I mean, based on the latest statistics that Stats SA provided, is that between the ages of 15 and 24, there's 63.2% of young people are not employed, as well as 41.2% for those between 25 and 35 years old. And that, I think, is a very scary statistic, because I think with unemployment comes various other social ills, various other challenges. We speak of poverty, we speak of social distress, we speak about our proneness to violence and violent conflict as well, right? And from a context perspective, that is to say, 1 in every 3 young people that you meet between the ages of 15 and 24 are not employed. right? And you go to other provinces like the Eastern Cape, where 6 in every 10 young people are not employed, 3 of them are unemployable, and the majority of those in that category happen to be Black women. So I think there are fundamental challenges that lie before us that we need to specifically address. So given those statistics, what are therefore some of the key challenges that are growing that we have seen in my space, and I think based on some of the research that many of us will engage with today? I think the first one is that there is a direct correlation between quality education, access to employment, to quality healthcare, to post-schooling opportunities, and economic opportunities. And I think if anything, COVID has revealed that to so many of us, right? The fact that only less than 24% of the country has access to private medical health, given the impact of the coronavirus, among many other challenges, tells you how dire the situation is, right? And then secondly, I mean, we often speak about entrepreneurship as the panacea towards this jobless economy that we have. And I think I would beg to differ. There's actually a correlation currently. There's a study that was released by the UCT School of Graduate Business School, specifically, that spoke about the fact that actually your odds to be successful in entrepreneurship is also directly correlated to how much further you have pursued education or your educational ambitions. So generally, a post-schooling qualification increases your odds. So I think at some point we need to stop necessarily the rhetoric that says young people must just be an entrepreneur, and understand that the ecosystem of entrepreneurship is something else. And third, as a key emerging trend, is that there's a great confluence of social media, social justice that is leading and leading to many social movements that are actually quite powerful. I think the key one that we've seen on the continent of Africa was, the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, and in South Africa, I think the Fees Must Fall is the one that is at the top of the agenda, among many other things. And I think this means that there's many opportunities around how do we look at various emerging technologies and lived experiences and utilize the things that are before us, like the power of technology, to ensure that we ask and push for social justice, and we necessarily have movements that add value, not only for ourselves, but for our broader communities. I think just to try and end it off here, to not go too much into things, there are 4 things that for me, I think need attention in the 2020s, right? The first is obviously the chronic unemployment that I've spoken about, but more specifically the underemployment. I think this is a context that is not being spoken about sufficiently. Because there's increased risk. I think we're seeing just in our neighboring country here in Mozambique, the impact of not growing economy, unstable leadership, but also the influx now of violent conflict that is happening in the north of Mozambique and north of Nigeria equally as well, that we have seen. So these are some of the issues we need to take cognizance of. I think secondly is that we must always acknowledge that the youth conversation is very broad, but it's also quite specific in how it plays out. And that is to say that generally there is a gender and a race lens to many of the youth issues that we are trying to tackle and that we will be tackling. And we have to be quite cognizant in the policies that we want to adopt going forward. Number 3, I think there's going to be a change in the landscape, especially in the political space. Representation will be paramount, especially proportional youth representation is going to be paramount across the board, right? Whether we're speaking about politics, whether we're speaking about business, and whether we're speaking about civil society. It is a part and parcel of how we develop a state that we ensure that young people are included in those particular spaces, but not only included, their voice are equally heard. The policy that SIA and the APRM just run is part and Jasara Consulting was quite important in that. And one of the things we acknowledge in reflection was also the need to ensure, which is the 4th point here, that inclusivity goes beyond just having the right people in the room, but we go to the right spaces, right? So many young people in peri-urban and rural communities remain underrepresented in many spaces that we occupy in the conversation that we have about youth development. So there is an emphasis around how do we ensure that young people who don't necessarily have the access that many of us probably in this particular platform have today are included in this space. Number 4 is that there's a care and a necessary issue that is at the heart of it, is that many young people are also, taking a stand around climate issues, right? Climate change being one of those key challenges we've seen from COP17 all the way to the current climate change movement. Secondly, and this is something that I've become really deeply passionate about, is the importance of mental health, right? And I think we're seeing it in a lot of space. As a personal anecdote, one of the programs we run in our company is a program that is a youth development program for employees who earn below a certain threshold. And one of the things we saw during COVID was the impact of mental health, right? So there are students who don't have access, who are not in private school or in former Model C schools, right, who have been impacted so much, because when you live in a home where the resources are so stretched, things like your mental health, like how your mental state are not considered as a priority. And the impact of that can be devastating in the short and in the long term. And I think we need to take priority to that, as well as, I think for me, quite importantly, the issue of racial justice and racial equality. And then my last point is something that I'm seeing, I think, in terms of the business community that I form part of currently, is that the disintermediation that is brought by technology currently is offering us an opportunity really to relook how our participation will look in the next decade or so. And this is in the political system, this is in governance structures and accountability measures, this is in mass mobilization and policy development. The fact that today's meeting, for example, takes place on a platform that maybe now we take for granted, but a year or 18 months ago, it was not necessarily the key focus, right? The fact that new and developing technologies are enabling us to interact and to engage in different ways that we've had before means that there's also an opportunity for us, not only as young people, but for those who are part and parcel of this journey, or who form part of this journey, really can ensure that we work together and develop a key policy. And I want to end off with that, because I think it's quite important. I think later on, if there is a point of engagement, I want to speak more around the notion of the VUCA, that we live in a society in which we call the VUCA, which is one, it is volatile, it is uncertain, it is complex, and it is ambiguous. And it is more so in relation to young people. And I think there's multiple perspectives that we ought to consider in how we're going to develop the relevant policies, but ensure that there's inclusivity in the engagement that relates to young people over the next decade or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for that thought-provoking opening. Now, youth development is described as a process that prepares a young person to meet the challenges of adolescence and adulthood and achieve their full potential, while advocacy is public support for or recommendation on a particular cause or policy. So now we are going to get into the part now where we really get into the discussion of defining youth development and advocacy in the 2020s and how we see it. And we are going to have different speakers who will be speaking on different thematic areas. These areas are all very important because my view is that each and every issue, be it a social issue, a political issue, an economic issue, any issue is a youth issue. And in Africa particularly, we have over 60% of our population being young people. Hence, there is this whole notion of harnessing the demographic dividend through investments in youth. So moving on to our next session, to our first session, I am going to hand over to Ms. Luanda Mpungose, who is going to speak to us on youth participation in Africa, progress and challenges. But before we get into a hand over to Luanda, I would just like to encourage everyone to still participate with us by clicking on the chat function where you can ask questions or pose your comments. After this session, we are going to open it up for an interactive session. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, please do post them on the chat. Please do follow Saya on Twitter and let us continue engaging on this topic on social media. Luanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Itumeleng. If I may just share my screen. Let me begin by recognizing the moderator, Itumeleng Pure, Ms. Prudence Ngwenya, head of the African Union Commission Youth Division in Addis Ababa, Mr. Kenneth Diole, SAIA National Council and Youth Development Practitioner as corrected, experts, guests, fellow youth, I greet you all this morning, all protocols observed. My name is Luanda Mbongwase, and I am a program officer with the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Perhaps let me begin by just acknowledging and saluting the previous speakers who have really set out the scene. From a continental and institutional level, Ms. Prudence Ngwenya has really given us insights on what the institution is doing, and Mr. Kenneth Diole, who's given us some insights in the key thematic areas for the 2020s. I have sought to undertake research that seeks to understand youth participation from a policy perspective. The paper I'm going to be presenting today, entitled Diverging Approaches to Youth Inclusion and Participation, was born out of the identification that there are a lot of divergences with respect to youth frameworks, national policies, initiatives, and importantly, implementation. While appreciating that, of course, Africa is a diverse continent and there is no one-size-fits-all approach, when it comes to normative frameworks, however, that are set out in the standards and codes, one may expect that there is a common understanding of the issues and ways to remedy these issues, at least from a policy perspective. Consequently, while Africa has rich frameworks on youth, its member countries do not share a common understanding on significant concepts that are pertinent to the implementation of youth policies as underpinned by these normative frameworks. This paper therefore contends that there is a disconnect and a lack of cohesiveness in how youth-related and youth-relevant frameworks and policies are understood and implemented in Africa. It has been mentioned by previous speakers that the African continent is a young continent. It is ranked one of the youngest continents in the world. And maybe to just try to illustrate this, I'll give the median age for a number of African countries. The median age in Niger is 15 years old, followed by Uganda at 15.5 years. Malawi, Mali, Zambia, South Sudan, and Mozambique have a median age of between 15 years to 16 years old. Burkina Faso, Burundi, and Chad have a median age of 17 years. Sierra Leone is at 19 years old. Rwanda follows at 20, while South Africa and Tunisia's median age is slightly higher at 26 years and 31.6 years, respectively. This illustrates the heterogeneity of youth across the continent, at least from an age perspective. Other factors of heterogeneity encompasses factors such as religion, rural, urban, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. So youth participation in Africa, what is this youth participation? Youth participation is defined as the ways in which young people can be involved in processes, institutions, and decisions that affect their lives. Roger Hart, a children's rights academic, contends that youth participation is a fundamental aspect of citizenship, and it's an integral part of democracy. With political will, young people can ascend to the highest decision-making structures, and in some instances and contexts, we are seeing that happen, but not enough. While participation and inclusion may be similar in definition, youth inclusion recognizes and emphasizes the diversity of youth. Policies and programs therefore need to purposefully meet the diverse needs and identities of young people in the African continent. So the frameworks that really guide, frameworks, action plans, and initiatives that guide youth participation in the African continent include, I think this is actually the most important one, the African Youth Charter, which is really it's the most important framework that really underpins how youth are to be engaged and how they are to participate at national and continental level. This was then followed by the Africa Youth Decade Plan of Action. And then in 2017, we saw the whole year being dedicated to youth, and it was called the African Union Year of Youth. This was then followed by a roadmap for harnessing the demographic dividend, and the moderator had already started to speak to this. And Ms. Prudence then told us about the 4 E's that has been initiated at the AUC level. And of course, the most important of all as well, the appointment of the AU Youth Envoy and the Envoys Youth Council. The lack of prompt uptake and domestication of these frameworks by AU member countries, for me personally, signals that issues related to youth are not well understood and have not always been demand-driven. To date, only 30 of 55 AU members have signed, ratified, and deposited the African Youth Charter. A total of 43 countries have signed the African Youth Charter, while 39 have ratified and deposited the African Youth Charter without really signing the charter. And the graphic that's on your screen right now gives you an indication of who has signed, who has ratified, and who has deposited, and who has not done anything at all. Some AU member states are listed as having ratified and deposited the charter, but are not signatories. This may mean that a country has developed a national policy that is guided or influenced by sections of this charter, but also takes into consideration its own country context and other international frameworks and commitments. For example, this paper found that Malawi's policy on youth takes cognizance of some sections of the charter, but it's not entirely based on the charter. It also looks at its international commitments in this regard. The AU then registers these countries as having ratified and deposited without being a signatory. For me, the implication of this is that these countries then cannot be held accountable to the provisions of the African Youth Charter. Furthermore, Malawi defines youth as people between the ages of 10 to 35, as opposed to the AU definition of 15 to 35. So this paper also wanted to underpin this conversation of youth participation in existing scholarship. So it uses participatory governance theory to anchor the idea of meaningful participation from existing scholarship. It is derived from the theoretical lens of good governance and concerned with creating favorable conditions for inclusivity and collective action. The central tenets of this theory is transparency, accountability, inclusivity, citizen participation, and collaborative partnerships. Typically, citizen participation in governmental processes focuses on measures to support and facilitate increased public access to information about government activities and initiatives. And in some contexts, it is fashioned by efforts to extend consultative processes and including citizens in matters that are of interest to them. The participatory governance approach challenges those assumptions and practices that hinder meaningful participatory democracy. It challenges the idea that limited consultations and information sharing, it demonstrates that participation is rather sustained engagement and some level of distribution of power. According to participatory governance experts, citizen participation needs to be based on more elaborate and diverse principles, institutions, and methods. Essential are more equal distribution of political power, a fairer distribution of resources, the decentralization of decision-making processes, the development of a wider and transparent exchange of knowledge and information, the establishment of collaborative partnerships, and emphasis on interinstitutional dialogue and greater accountability. In the African context, contrary to countries reporting achievements in youth development, what this paper finds is that a lot of the youth policies in African Union member countries is very focused on a rights-based approach to youth policies. It looks at the rights to young people having education, having jobs, having service delivery, and so forth, but really do neglect the most critical part of the African Youth Charter, which is Article 12, and it is now displayed on the screen. So it really looks at the protection of children's rights and stuff like that, and does not lend itself to the participatory governance approaches and the stipulations of this charter. And vast amount of national policies across the African continent, they just really lack in this regard. And I don't know at this point if I can say that the leaving out of Article 12 is very purposeful, or is it really stemming from the fact that we as a continent do not have a common understanding and a progressive understanding of participation and inclusion. So lack of inclusion has been more prevalent among the younger constituency in Africa. And given widespread perceptions that young people are a ticking time bomb or prone to political manipulation, I must admit that political and a drop in political participation by young people is a growing concern. However, Afrobarometer claims that a lack of interest in public affairs is common among young people who are deprived of basic necessities. Issues such as service delivery, corruption, and equitable electoral processes contribute to a decline in the political and civic engagement. So young people are not moving back from participating in political affairs purely because they don't want to or they're not interested, but there actually are valid reasons as to why they are doing so. The 2019 Mo Ibrahim Forum report concludes 60% of Africans, and especially youth, think that their governments are doing a fairly bad job at addressing the needs of young people. This is evidenced, for example, by the scores of young people dying in the Mediterranean in an attempt to seek better opportunities in Europe and such. The static youth movement further notes that although young people or youth make up a majority of electoral voters, they constitute only 1% of members of parliament across the sub-region. This may have increased, but very slightly, as a result of South Africa and Namibia increasing the percentage of youth MPs. The creation of youth bodies without meaningful participation become very detrimental, as we see the trend is to sort of create youth bodies which are siloed or just left as just youth bodies without really feeding into the larger processes. I believe that actually without meaningful ways and meaningful approaches, that actually harms us as young people. These platforms have become a great vehicle for empowerment, but there is a tendency to use them to ostracize young people and not fully mainstream them into institutions and decision-making bodies. It becomes yet another way to tokenize youth and tick boxes without fully allowing them to participate, as per Article 12 of the Charter. And in the paper, we looked at a Kenyan case study in this regard. Following the promulgation of the new constitution in Kenya in 2012, the Kenya National Youth Council was created as an umbrella body to feed youth into government policies. The council is noted by the interviewee in the paper that it's become a toothless giant that has become a proxy for politicians. Prior to Kenya's 2017 presidential election, the council was due to undergo an election of its own to elect the representatives. This did not happen owing to the reluctance of politicians to undergo such a process during a critical time, which is, of course, election season. Another challenge curtailing effectiveness of this National Youth Council is funding. And the issue of funding cuts across a lot of other countries and a lot of youth bodies, and it really does hinder participation. In Kenya, it does not have an independent budget and derives its resources from the Ministry of Public Services, Gender and Youth Affairs. These end up being reserved for salaries rather than actual programs for young people. This paper goes on to apply a participatory governance analysis on the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is a specialized agency of the African Union as it embarks on its mainstreaming of youth and assisting member countries to do the same. It looks at the various processes and tools that can be applied, where mainstreaming can be applied, and takes this very abstract analysis and gives it a practical feel. But in the interest of time, I will not go into that. And I have posted links to this paper on the chat function. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Luanda, for sharing with us your research findings. It is really an extensive research, and I implore everyone to take the time to read Luanda's research. And moving on to our next speaker, we will be discussing what ails the young. And to take us through that session, I'm going to hand over to Terence Corrigan from the Institute of Race Relations.
Yeah, thank you then, Tumaleng. Just let me try and share a screen here. When I was asked to do this, I must say that I had my doubts because, unfortunately, I can't claim to be youth anymore. Let's see. Do we have it? Okay. Having a bit of trouble sharing this, sharing my presentation here. I don't know if anybody is able to give me any assistance.
Terence, we are able to see your presentation.
Oh, can you? All
Yes.
right. Okay, well, I can't. All right. This presentation works is based on a paper I wrote a couple of years ago for SIRE when I was a research fellow. And I was going principally through the material in the APRM reports. What are Africa's youth prospects and its youth politics? The title I gave it was "What Ails the Young." It's generally, I think, accepted that this is a major strategic area for Africa. Now, I think if we're on the same page, what you can see is a little breakdown of Africa's population. 1.34 billion in total, of whom about 2/3 at 995 million are 34 or younger. Just close to 800,000 24 or younger, and in that 15 to 24 age group, even though this is sort of the international as opposed to the African definition, about 250 million young people. Now, each of these represents someone with aspirations, with hopes, and faced with profound challenges in advancing and living and living a meaningful life. The Burkina Faso country review report from the APRM said two things which I thought were interesting in that they contrasted with each other. One, the youth component of the population is a force for hope in the future of the nation and the transformation of existing structures. But this will only materialize if young people identify with the objectives of the society in place. If they do not, if they see no prospects for themselves, no prospects in the social projects that are undertaken, they will become a destructive force at the first sign of discontent. Those are strong words, very strong words indeed. So what I would like to argue is that African youth issues, and I think this has been made by previous speakers, mirror the challenges confronting the continent's people as a whole, but frequently at a heightened intensity. The African Youth Charter, for instance, lists a comprehensive a range of issues. And in a sense, almost everything could be seen as a youth issue. But there are two broad families which come out powerfully. The first is education and skills. Now, this has also been discussed earlier, and I'd like to tip my hat to Kenneth talking about the concept of, well, I'll get to that later. All right. Well, what the continent has seen is growing access and enrollment in education, but not universal, and there are still substantial disparities in access, quality between within societies, resource constraints, economic constraints, and cultural barriers. You think about the demands on young people who have to perhaps tend fields or livestock on a family farm, live very far away from where education is provided. The idea that schooling is something for males still continues to dog the life chances of females, or conversely, where you see a woman very well represented in educational institutions, as you do in some parts of North Africa, but that may not be a good that may not be seen as a desirable means of social mobility. Teaching is often a very low status occupation, and I was a teacher for a number of years, and I remember hearing a story where a headmaster of a school addressed a conference and said, why did you become a teacher? And he was taking comments from the audience, and one person stood up and said, because my choices in life were, if I wanted a white collar job, were nursing or teaching. And I think, unfortunately, this is a reality across across the continent. Teaching is often not well rewarded. It doesn't offer the mobility, but it gives a sort of toehold into a sort of middle class, or what passes for a middle class life. So there are a lot of people, I think, who are in this game that would rather be elsewhere. And then I think very, very important, the mismatch between what the training available and what markets need. We often tend to look at education as a simple whole numbers game. You know, we put so many kids through university and so many graduations or whatever. Are those necessarily the skills that a society needs? Now, this is not a uniquely African thing. It's been very well catalogued and discussed in the United States, for instance. Do we, for societies that have big, hard developmental issues, you know, the needs to build infrastructure to manage into the nuts and bolts of technical projects. You know, these skills are often not available, even though we have masses and masses of unemployed people who would gladly do that sort of work. When you go to big mining developments in most of the continent, you'd be surprised how many expatriates you find. And you know, these are not necessarily from Europe or America. I'm talking people from the Philippines, for instance. Member of my family did some work in the DRC, and half the mining compound that he worked on was being run by Filipino technicians. The African Economic Outlook, I think, put this very well. Often a degree from a tertiary institution is an entry requirement for government employment with little attention paid to a specific skill set. At some point, I think this is something that Africa and its various countries and its education bureaucracies, both public and private, are going to have to wrestle with. Are they preparing children for the opportunities, or young people for the opportunities that that exist, for the needs of those societies, or are they selling them some sort of shibboleth that is perhaps usable or applicable in another part of the world? The other one, and this, this is Kenneth's point, I think is very important. Poverty and unemployment. Now, these are interrelated challenges, and I think probably amongst Africa's most serious. High levels of youth unemployment hold youth in poverty, and they undermine prospects for social mobility. And I think that second point, the social mobility, is something that we often lose sight of. It is not merely the ability to earn an income and to satisfy your needs as they exist now, but the sense that things will be better for you in 10 years' time. Once again, this is not unique to Africa. In some of the world's wealthiest, most developed societies, we sort of have a generation of young people who cannot look at their lives the way that their parents could, that they were doing better than their parents, and their children will probably do better than they. What we have is a situation in which, you know, prospects are put on hold almost indefinitely. Underemployment, very important. That you have some sort of means of earning an income. And there was an Indian economist who once said that you often do not find the unemployed amongst the poor amongst the unemployed, because it takes considerable resources to afford to be unemployed. So people hustle, they get by, they scrape by under the breadline, but they often find themselves unable to live a life that gives them fulfillment and meaning. I think it's particularly problematic for tertiary graduates, frustrated expectations. And you know, that's why, you know, you will see many of the continent's most gifted, most high potential individuals going and seeking opportunities elsewhere, or seeking opportunities within the continent that may well not match the skills that they've trained for. There's a critique of the operations of a lot of development organizations that you have chemists and economists and whatever who will take jobs as drivers because they're articulate, they have soft skills, and they realize that they're probably going to be able to earn more money doing this than what they were trained to do. And that essentially accounts for a massive squandering of the investment. Zambia, a country review report. High levels of poverty, increasing unemployment, poor access to services, and weakening of family support systems have been pointed out as some of the threats to the survival of development of children and young people. I think take note of that family support system. What ails the young is not purely a matter of dollars and cents. It is about the integration into a society. And here, something very haunting was said by the late Robert F. Kennedy in America about when a young man is unable to stand before his family as a breadwinner, he also loses the ability to stand before society as a man. Now, maybe that's gendered language or whatever, but I think the important point is that this gets at the ability to participate in society, to fulfill your responsibilities as an adult. So hence the socio-political ramifications. Young people not being absorbed in the mainstream or adult society has serious and potentially destabilizing consequences. There's a phenomenon which has been identified called waithood, that interregnum between school or training, such as it may be, and finding any kind of niche in society. And this can go on for years and years and years. In some ways, a squandering of that early potential. And if we're talking about demographic dividends, this is something that should not, that we really should not have to contend with. We need that a demographic dividend would be creating opportunities and pushing young people into work, maybe not great work, maybe low skilled work, but getting them onto some sort of mobility track. The poor socialization, also something not unique to Africa. Urbanization, early sexual maturity, the inability to support nascent families, the stress, the mental health issues mentioned earlier, very important. And the use of disaffected young people as political muscle. This comes out in a number of the APRM's studies. Sierra Leone, Nigeria. Kids with young people with very little to offer, few prospects for an employment, poor socialization into peer or kindred groups. They can look for their sense of belonging elsewhere. Throwing stones, breaking up meetings, becoming essentially a kind of political muscle. Activism. Once more, I think that we'd all agree that activism is an intrinsic part of democracy and at base a fundamentally good thing. But let's not romanticize it. When activism starts to become a proxy or a replacement for leading one's life, when the demands for something better become a substitute for actually being able to muster, to earn, to acquire those things themselves, then you have a severe dysfunction in society. The frustrations and the demands start to overtake the prospects, and then of course crime, desperation perhaps, but that reverberates through the entire society. Now, on a positive note, African youth have shown a great deal of resilience. Anyone who has gone to any African city is probably acquainted with young people hustling, trying to sell things, knocking on doors, looking for work. The informal sector has been able to take up a goodly chunk of this. Although once again, understand the informal sector has a particular role. It is not generally the incubator of formal sector businesses. The skills that are applicable there do not necessarily apply to working in a formal company. There's also a lot of evidence about the entrepreneurial orientation. Africans like private business. They respect entrepreneurs, but they are often forced to endure an environment which is extremely hostile and unconducive. So the comment made earlier about entrepreneurship being a panacea is entirely on the money. It's not, and it will not be until you understand the kind of chains that produce successful entrepreneurs, and take the requisite actions to bring that out. Policy responses, well, variable success, but youth policies, youth political and bureaucratic loci, your youth commissions and so on. You're encouraging a youth voice, the reservation of seats for youth, and then the encouragement of youth employment and entrepreneurship. Now, I think that there's a place for all of this. In itself, though, I don't think any of these are likely to be decisive. I don't think that that the continent has the administrative ability to advance these agendas adequately to make a real dent. I don't think that the resources for such programs are ever going to be adequate. And I think that however well intentioned or even well designed they may be, until the overall environment in the continent has changed, you are going. They are sort of permanently going to be fringe initiatives with very limited reach. So what can be done? Okay. Well, I wish I knew. My sense, though, is that in very, very broad brushstrokes, and if you look at the paper, I discuss these issues in somewhat more detail. I think the rudiments of solutions, first of all, we need better data to understand what, in any given context, places an undue burden on the youth, and what blockages might be reduced to make things incrementally better. Now, a presentation like this simply isn't going to be able to do it, because you're dealing with an enormous variety. But the prospects for a young person in, say, rural Ghana are not the same, and the circumstances are very different from one in the city center of Johannesburg. So we need to understand that. Also, to understand, what do we mean when we talk about things like quality education? What exactly are you after there? Dealing with a broader societal context, and I think this is particularly important if we're serious about things like entrepreneurship. You can throw as much money into entrepreneurial support, and South Africa does. The resources are not that it's trying to put in this have not been small, for very, very little reward. It's not going to make much difference if at every corner your nascent entrepreneur has to navigate some other obstacle, whether it's excessive administrative requirements, so-called red tape, whether it's a collapsed infrastructure that means you can't get your good from A to B, whether it's people shaking you down for bribes all the time. More functional states and better organized societies, I think, would not be a panacea, but would have a disproportionate effect on youth development. And then be pragmatic and realistic about what can be achieved. I have sat in many meetings like this where we've discussed, what needs to be done about issue X, Y, and Z, and ideas about cradle to grave welfare states, resources being apportioned on a scale that is just unworkable, that just don't exist. That doesn't do any good. We need to, having identified the problem, and that's part of the better data, what interventions, however small they may be at the beginning, can yield results. And maybe this is not youth specific. Maybe this is about the licensing of trade or the provision of professional services. And I think this also introduces the idea of trade-offs. And this is why I say, you know, one should, I think, always be very skeptical about demands made by activists. Activism, as I say, is a crucial thing for a democracy, and I think we always need more rather than less of it. But beware about things that are presented as being for the greater good of society. Should a society provide emphasize tertiary education, which is probably only going to be accessible to a very small number, or early childhood development? These are tough questions, and I don't have easy answers for them. But that is the challenge that confronts the continent's policymakers and its political leaders. And with that, I will sign off, and I prepare myself for the slings and arrows of my detractors and the praise of my supporters.
Thank you very much, Terence, for your presentation. Indeed, young people in Africa are always resilient in the face of difficulty. And we see that there is a deep entrepreneurship in Africa. And we see in countries like Ethiopia, for example, where their public employment service has dedicated one-stop shops to assisting and providing support to young entrepreneurs. We see a whole lot of young people around the continent becoming venturing into entrepreneurship. However, we still cannot side-eye the high unemployment rates and the skills deficit that we are currently facing on the continent. And with that, I am going to open up 10 minutes for an interactive session. You can raise your hand and pose a question to any of the speakers that we have had today, or to make your remarks. You can also use the chat function and the question and answer section where you can pose your questions. We will read them out, and the relevant speaker will answer your question or respond to your comment. Indeed, youth issues or the youth conversation is very broad yet specific, as our second speaker, Kenneth, pointed out previously. So if you have any questions, kindly raise your hand. You will be unmuted and recognized so you can speak. But while we wait for people to raise hands, I will just read the first question that we have on our Q&A section. It is directed to Terence. It says that, Terence, you have made a point around the intense resources needed to afford to the unemployed. It made me think about unemployment rates across SSA, Southern Africa. Where stats might suggest youth unemployment rates of only 10% across the region, whereas South Africa's rate is over 50%. Added to this, youth participation in the informal economy seems to be more recognized regionally compared to in South Africa. How do we make sense of these disparities in national youth unemployment rates? Is it linked to a combination of data collection, politics, definitions of unemployment, and the size of the formal economy? So this question is from Stephen Rebello.
Okay, look, I think that is obviously one of those questions where I'm gonna defer to say we need more data. But my instinct is the following. I think that there are questions about data collection. Secondly, the definition of unemployment requires that people, certainly in South Africa, and I think this is true the world over, that you are not considered technically unemployed if you are not looking for work. And you are not available. Available for work. So I think that in South Africa we do have a massive problem with discouragement. That's well attested to in Stats SA's research on the matter. I would also imagine that elsewhere in the continent, as you correctly say, there is a greater recognition of the importance of informal and, let's say, family-based work, where countries are more rural and where people are where larger portions of the population are working in subsistence activities. I think that will draw in a lot of people who in a more industrialized society have aspirations to work elsewhere in the economy. Just remember something: South Africa is 66% urbanized, and that accelerates every year. This, that even a country like Zimbabwe comes nowhere close. So yes, I think that those sort of activities are perhaps more available or more recognized elsewhere, and then possibly also I think that there are things that account for a sort of low grade, semi begging employment in terms of let's say the guys who come and offer to wash your car when you're in the city centre, or at least before COVID. If someone is able to wash 2 cars a day, you can say that person is unemployed. Now, it's very, very little money. I mean, I'm not saying it's a great career choice, but that person may well report themselves as not being as not being employed. One other possible explanation is the size of South Africa's welfare net. Now, I'm not getting into any kind of argument here about whether that's bad or good. And I think given the state of our society, I think it's very necessary, although it's a massive strategic problem going forward as to how it's funded. But a small old age grant or something like that can be stretched to cover a number of people. So the 18 or 19 million people who receive social grants, those grants paid are distributed across a much wider population, and perhaps that makes it possible for young people who are angry and discouraged, a sense that they may be living on a sort of starvation level, but at least they're alive, and in a sense they it provides a backstop. That would be my response.
Thank you very much. We also have a hand up from David Mutambirwa. If you can unmute yourself and pose your question or comment. After David, we also have a hand up from Kenneth Diole. So immediately after David, Kenneth can also make a comment or question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is, in Africa, due to a lot of unemployment, whereby most of the youth are seated by the roadside smoking and doing illicit activities, is it not a harbinger for conflicts where they are easily recruited by insurgents and be involved in war, which will actually be detrimental to our survival? That is my contribution.
Thank you very much, David. We also have a hand up from Kenneth. Kenneth, you can unmute and pose your comment or question.
Okay, thank you, Tumale. I think I wanted to mention one thing around data that Terence brought up in his presentation, which is a key thing that I think we take for granted in the broader African continent, right? So most of you guys would remember the Bring Back Our Girls campaign in Nigeria. And one of the key details why it took so long actually to bring back the girls, actually to identify where they were, was that the northern parts of Nigeria are unmapped. That is to say that even the Nigerian government itself does not properly know where what is in those northern parts, which is where the girls were held, right? And that was as a result of the lack of data. But secondly, especially in Nigeria, is we've often underestimated the population of Nigeria. And one of the reasons why that was the case was because there was never a proper census. We got a proper sort of insights when there was a proliferation of SIM cards and data. So because those are recorded and you can keep account of it, we started having an understanding of the type of population that there is in that particular country. So I think the thing about data is quite important because it gives you a much more accurate perspective when you design policy and who you are designing it for, and is it relevant and contextually appropriate for the people that you are trying to design it for. My second comment is really maybe to the gentleman who just spoke before me, which is around young people who sit on the street and smoke and everything else. And I think one, you learn to really suspend judgment, because I think in conversation you start to understand that unfortunately where there's a lack of opportunity, where there's a lack of access, and where there's a lack of many things that are meaningful in terms of our contribution to the society as and how we would desire, all the other substances have become easily available, and they become the places where many people go and hide in, right? To narrow and almost mitigate their lived reality. So I think we must probably more lead with a conscious mind that we don't understand as much as we think we do, and maybe suspend our presumptions in those particular levels. The third part, I think, is my last point is Luanda raised an important part around some of the articles and really the fact that most of our African states that have not only ratified but adopted the African Youth Charter is that we're lacking in those things. And I think a key part we saw recently was that there's an important component around how a country sees youth development policies or agendas, and how it implements it into its national discourse is actually quite paramount in dealing and mitigating the challenges that are affecting young people. Because in many ways, the issues that affect young people are not exclusive to young people, right? We just, unfortunately, because of how they are more severe within the youth segment, we focus on that. But I think has to be a push, especially within the various African Union bodies, and even in our addressing of the Agenda 2063, we have to have a greater emphasis around lobbying and our governments to ensure that they recognize the various policy documents or recommendations that have been put across many different jurisdictions in this continent to ensure that young people form part and parcel of that space. Because unfortunately, we'll continue to have conversations like these if we do not necessarily make sure that they are addressing those key components. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I am going to take one more hand and then we will move on to our second session. We will still have time and an opportunity to have further discussions and ask questions in the second session. So the last hand that I'm going to take up is from Dambi Sahara. Please unmute yourself and pose your question or comments.
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to pose this to Luanda, who spoke a lot about the inclusion of youth in things like making policy and all of that. How do we contend, I guess, with what I would maybe call parental culture in Africa, and how that impacts the way authority engages with the youth? Because, we can't necessarily make broad brushstrokes, but I know by and large African culture is that young people, when adults are speaking, you speak when spoken to, or you don't really challenge what your elders are saying or the way things are done. And I think because that is the way that a lot of young people have been raised, that impacts the way that we would engage with authority in some regards, and also the way in which authority will, allow us credibility. So how then do we kind of, contend with the prevailing culture in the smaller sectors of society, like families and that, and how that impacts the way we engage with youth with regards to policy and inclusion?
Thank you very much, Dambisa, for your comment. And it speaks a lot to inclusivity. And when we had Kenneth make one of his 4 points, the fourth being inclusivity, which goes beyond having the right people in the room. And this making on a broader scale, making youth participation firstly impactful and meaningful. And I guess it goes to us even interrogating strategies and policies in which we have that are currently put in place for the betterment of young people. Policies such as the African Youth Charter, and in the South African context, the National Youth Policy, which has now been enacted for 2020 until 2030. How many people were actually engaged in the amendment of this bill, and were their contributions taken into consideration? Yes, the door was open, but did the inclusivity go beyond having all the right people in the room? And in this context, it makes you think of how civil society working with young people is engaged, because Luanda also spoke a lot about youth structures that exist but are very redundant. So how are civil society organizations that are actively doing work with young people, capacity building, policy participation, advocacy, how much are they considered? And are they taken in as a door towards getting the voices of young people and having them define what youth policy, advocacy and participation is in the 2020s. I am now going to move on to our next session. So this is our last session. Our first speaker will be speaking on peace, youth, peace and security, and it is Ms. Munezo Kujeke from the ISS.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As she mentioned, my name is Munezo Kujeke, and I work on youth, peace and security at the Institute for Security Studies. A big thank you to Saya for inviting me to speak today. Platforms to speak on this contemporary issue are always welcome, and I'm excited to share with you a couple of reasons why this is a key issue for the consideration of not only policy and decision makers, but also for young people working at the grassroots to make their communities safe and prosperous. I hope I can do this effectively within the 10 minutes that have been allocated to me. Now, when we speak youth, peace and security, we are talking about the dynamics surrounding young men and women between the ages of 15 and 35, especially in Africa. Our age group that we work with when we talk young people is 15 and 35. In youth, peace and security, we want to talk about their interfaces and views on conflict prevention, conflict resolution, peace building, as well as cross-cutting issues such as gender, violent extremism, migration, and even climate change. Now, the question we ought to address today is, why is it an area of importance in the 2020s? So the answer is simple. Youth, peace and security is actually the flavor of the season in the world of peace, security, and development. It has been turned by the African Union Peace and Security Council and the United Nations Security Council into a formally recognized agenda. This is a great win, and it follows in the footsteps of others like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Firstly, unlike gender, which is a driving force for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, youth is a transitional phase. You are not permanently youth. It comes and goes, and that is the attitude that policymakers within governance, peace and security circles have adopted. Lots of them consider that those within this transitional phase need to be guided or need to be offered direction. So why make long-term plans for them? They could be asking that question. So this thinking is ignorant of the fact that young people are not only foot soldiers in conflict, but that they can play a larger part in conflict resolution and peace building. And secondly, and equally important, is the fact that it took a long time to get an understanding of what youth, peace, and security means, especially within the 5 geographical regions of Africa. In 2019, in support of the African Union Commission's Youth for Peace Africa initiative to research and write a study on young people's contributions to peace and security, I traveled to Madagascar and Mozambique. I met a lot of young people who are working in the sphere of peace and security and how it relates to youth. But I can assure you that finding them was very hard. The AU put out a call for youth groups working in peace and security to avail themselves for regional consultations and eventually field work. The call in Southern Africa was tricky because the jargon used in the advert spoke of youth and thematic designations of peace and security, like post-conflict reconstruction and development, peace support operations. These terms are used, but they're not very common amongst young people in Southern Africa. Our call had to be broader, a call to young people working towards democratic governance, advocating for an end to societal ills such as corruption and gender-based violence. Once that happened, we had a rich group of young people coming forward. To them, these are contemporary peace and security issues. Now in Madagascar, there were young men and women that I met who were advocating for the recognition and protection of the small LGBTQI community on the island. Others wanted the cattle raiding and vanilla farm violence to end. To youth on the island, these were peace and security matters. And in Mozambique, the need for young people to be visibly represented in parliament was a peace and security issue that landed many young activists in jail. When I was there, most youth groups were too fearful to talk about what is happening in Cabo Delgado. It was such a new phenomenon that I felt that in Maputo, they felt detached from what was going on in the north of their country. Either way, these young people were still carving out an understanding of the agenda that was unique to their reality. The key lesson here is the youth peace and security agenda is not defined by the absence of armed conflict, especially in Southern Africa. And going forward in the 2020s, it shall remain that way. I'll tell you a story that some might find humorous, but it shines a light on how integrating the thinking behind youth peace and security in Africa is significant and urgent. During a regional youth consultation in Gaborone, a local woman said, Botswana is relatively safe. But one day, people suspected that there was a bomb by the parliament building. We as young people got excited and started taking selfies with this little bomb structure. It was shocking, but quite amusing because we have to understand that the youth of Botswana have not been exposed to a full-blown armed conflict. And 2 weeks later, we had East African consultations in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea. We retold this story to the youth attending this meeting. They were shocked, so shocked that some could not believe that this was told by a young person living on the same continent as them. The youth in Asmara were mostly from war-affected countries in the Horn of Africa, and they would definitely not go anywhere near something that is suspected to be a bomb. This also adds to a narrative of how you can have one community fearing the gun, being traumatized by it, yet you have another that feels safe when they see a gun because that's what it represents, safety. Now, all this back and forth in trying to understand if we in Africa actually have one voice when it comes to youth peace and security has culminated in various consultations, studies, and even normative frameworks by the AU regional economic communities like IGAD and ECOWAS as well. From Luanda's presentation, you should have noticed that the continent is not without paper evidence of the need for increased youth engagement and empowerment, but what is lacking is the implementation in our AU member states. The AU now has a continental framework on youth peace and security. This was adopted by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union in 2020. The document habitually mirrors the United Nations Resolution 2250 from 2015. It does this by prioritizing prevention, participation, protection, partnerships and coordination, and disengagement and reintegration. Now, this framework should be the reason youth peace and security is to remain relevant in the 2020s. It even has a 10-year implementation plan. However, as I indicated earlier, implementation could be the curse of the continent. We might try to use the pandemic as an excuse as to why the youth at grassroots levels from Juba to Pemba are not reaping the benefits of the agenda. But with or without a pandemic, AU member states, as in their governments, are not talking youth, peace and security enough. Young people in the streets of Antananarivo, for instance, do not know that the AU has produced this framework. So if you ask them, and now I mean the young people from all over the continent, be it young people in youth networks, organizations, or academia, they will blame it on a surplus of issues that boil down to one thing. For Africa to prioritize youth, peace, and security, governments have to exhibit political will, along with the private sector. They need to support a call for human and financial resources for youth-led ventures. And most importantly, young people will tell you that they are tired of being viewed as just clients for the agenda instead of being partners. Because we do not have time to delve into our discussion a little deeper, I want to remind you and ask that you reflect on the fact that youth, peace and security will always refer to the conscious actions and processes to protect young people from participation in and from being victims of violent conflicts and insecurity. It remains an agenda about promoting and supporting their contributions to peace efforts in conflicts and post-conflict situations. This acknowledges the need for institutionalized initiatives and targeted actions. It points to the key elements of protecting youth as part of a broader civilian population. What the youth, peace and security agenda now needs is to leave the hallways of elite policy buildings and start to work on the ground for Africa's youth. So I look forward to a very fruitful question and answer session, and I hope to actually hear your perspectives on this. And thank you, moderator. I hope I was within my 10 minutes of allocated time.
Thank you very much for that thought-provoking presentation. Young people continue to be the most affected by wars and conflicts on the continent, and youth, peace and security remains a very key and pivotal issue on the continent. Before we move on to our next speakers, I would just like for everyone in the session to please click on the chat function. There is a link that has an M&E form. Please click on it and give feedback about this event. Saya needs feedback about this event so that we can find how you found the event and how we can improve on our events. My second request from everyone present today is for you to just go on the chat function and also just tell us what you think is the key, are going to be the key themes for youth participation and advocacy in the 2020s. So what key themes will be pertinent for youth in the 2020s? Can you please just type for us what the key themes will be for young people in the 2020s, and type that for us in the chat function. Moving on to our next speakers. Our next speakers will be speaking on youth in nuclear. And we have Professor Yo Ansi from UNISA and Mr. Yarik from SAYA, who will be speaking on this issue. Over to you.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope everyone is well. Professor Van Wyk and I have a presentation prepared, so let me just start sharing my screen. Professor, would you like to start?
I can start. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Okay. Is the screen being shared?
Yes, Yarek, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I will start then. Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share details of our project that is part of the SAIA Atoms for Development project that is generously funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As has been said this morning, the youth plays a very important part in the African continent currently, and most importantly, as the youth is the future, although it has been portrayed as a cliche, it is exactly because it is so important. So how do we link the youth and atoms or nuclear energy on the continent? So this particular project is a 3-year project that commenced in 2019. And as I indicated, funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and implemented by SAIA. The aim is particularly to strengthen African nuclear governance to support the peaceful applications of nuclear technology for Africa's development. In other words, to see how African development and through the use of nuclear energy could be used for the achievement of the ideals of Agenda 2063, the AU developmental blueprint for the continent, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So our activities so far, since we started in 2019, has been to conduct research on Africa's nuclear sector and nuclear governance, has been advocacy, and has been public discourse. So this is some background on our project. To move on then, I can, if Yari can just page for us, why is it important that we consider nuclear in Africa? And especially why is it important for the youth to take cognizance of these developments? 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have the same power capacity as Spain, although their combined population is 18 times larger. Over half of sub-Saharan Africa's capacity is in one country, South Africa. Nuclear technology can make a significant contribution to socio-economic development in Africa. As I've indicated, to support these two developmental blueprints, particularly through the use of nuclear-derived electrification. So our project has so far identified 3 case studies, South Africa, Egypt, and Ghana, to show that the increased electrification and a more stable electricity supply are the main reasons for the pursuit of nuclear energy. Yarick, right, the top electrified countries, electrification countries in the continent is Mauritius, that has a rate of 100%, Seychelles also 100%, Tunisia 100%, and then it goes down with South Africa and the 9th position, 94.3% in terms of the electrification of the country. As we can see that the lowest, the bottom list in terms of countries, in terms of electrification, is South Sudan, starting with 1.1% of its population and its electricity grid provision in the country. The Central African Republic is similarly low on its electrification. Other states in this category is Burkina Faso. It also includes Somalia, Niger, Malawi, Liberia, Burundi. The DRC chart are countries at the bottom of this list. Yarick, you are welcome to continue from here on, and I will take over once again.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Yancy. Yes, so as Professor Van Wyk just indicated, we've got a big discrepancy between electrification in Africa. Some countries are at 100% electrification for their population, and then others are at 1% or 3%. So clearly, nuclear may not be a solution for everybody, but it is a valid option for countries that are looking to provide more electricity for the population. And in the case of a country like South Africa, even though it's got electrification rates of 9.4%, meaning that not quite every single citizen in the country has access to electricity, but the vast majority do, 94%. But of course, we live in an era of load shedding that has been going on for almost 2 decades now. So it's a case of not necessarily providing electricity to more people, but ensuring a more stable electricity supply, so that when people are putting on their heaters on in the winter and maybe also watching their TV and running hot showers, then people can do it at the same time without load shedding happening for 2 hours or sometimes 4 hours or even 6 hours, as we've experienced in the past couple of years. So in terms of nuclear in Africa, there's a very important global framework, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. And its Article 4 asserts the right of all states to the peaceful use of nuclear technology. So essentially, the treaty looks at both trying to prohibit the proliferation and the spread of nuclear weapons, but at the same time, it promotes the use of nuclear for peaceful developmental purposes. And indeed, in Africa, it seems to be a rational solution for some states to use it in their energy mix, because many African countries already possess the natural resources which are required for nuclear energy, including uranium, plutonium, thorium, zirconium, and others. So at the moment, at least 17 African countries, almost a third of the countries on the continent, are already using nuclear in one way or another, perhaps through limited research reactors, or South Africa is currently the only country on the continent that has a nuclear power plant, but Egypt is also looking to join it soon. And you can see, I'm not going to go through the list of the entire 17 countries, but I just included it here in the slide so you can see that it comes from all regions of Africa. We have Southern Africa, we have North Africa, we have West Africa, we have East Africa. So the spread is quite large around the continent of countries that are looking at least at the possibility of developing a nuclear program at one stage of the other. And of course, something that's very relevant in the current day is to speak about the use of nuclear for COVID. Apologies for the oversight for the slide saying COVID-10, it's of course COVID-19. So that's just a typo. I'm not referring to any new variants that may have originated. And nuclear-derived technology can be used to detect the coronavirus, also sanitize equipment, prevent zoonotic disease, achieve food security, especially during the current unstable times, and then also treat medical conditions. So it goes beyond mere electrification for the population. But then just to also touch on the challenges, because there's always two sides to the coin, and it's not always positive. And nuclear, of course, comes with a lot of baggage. If we only think of Chernobyl and Fukushima nuclear disasters. So, of course, the main challenge is the safe and secure handling of nuclear materials, plants, reactors, and then also of the waste disposal of nuclear material. Another challenge we've identified in some of our case studies, particularly in the case study of Egypt, is a top-down approach. Government essentially taking all the decisions, not having any civil society involvement, and also no youth involvement. And we'll be touching on the role of the youth a bit later in the presentation. Also high costs. These plants do not come cheap, and most of the costs are upfront, and the necessity to involve external partners from outside of the continent who often want to control intellectual property, expertise, bring their own people in rather than developing local expertise, and also other aspects of nuclear programs. And nuclear proliferation as well. So I've already mentioned the NPT, the Global Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, but it's also important to mention two other treaties, the Pelindaba Treaty that essentially proclaims Africa as a nuclear weapon free zone. Of course, we're looking at 55 countries that are members of the African Union. Out of them, 52 have signed, 42 have ratified the Pelindaba Treaty, which is good, but not great, because ideally something like this should be universally signed and ratified, since it looks at the entire continent. And then also the nuclear weapons ban treaty that has come into force in January of this year. In Africa, unfortunately, we're seeing very low uptake, with 29 signing, but only 9 ratifying. And Prof. Van Wyk and I actually wrote a paper on the nuclear weapons ban treaty that should be coming out in a couple of weeks or so on the SIA website, in case you're interested. I'm just using this as a shameless advertising space for our research. Let me hand over back to you, Prof, to specifically speak about the role of youth in nuclear, which I've already alluded to.
Thank you very much, Jarek. As has already been mentioned by other presentations this morning, is that more than almost two-thirds of the population of Africa is under 25. So nuclear energy projects have a lifespan of 30 to 50 years, which is basically 2 to 3 generations that are affected by nuclear projects. In other words, decisions that are taken now will affect young Africans for the rest of their lives. So if a country embarks on the development of a nuclear power plant, for example, that takes almost 50 years. In other words, 2 generations will be affected by that lifespan of a plan. The continent's natural resources, such as coal, oil, and gas, are being depleted, while nuclear provides an alternative source of energy. And we must be mindful that nuclear is not always regarded as a safe and reliable and even a green form of energy. Well, it depends on what particular side of the fence you are on, but I think this is a debate for another opportunity. We know, for example, that a lot of the continent's uranium resources are exported, and the continent is also affected mostly by human-induced climate change, for example. Nuclear energy has been proposed as an alternative, clean source of energy that has a longer sustainability and a more reliable source of energy also. We also know that the medical applications of nuclear power have the potential to improve the health and quality of life for the current generation of Africans. And in fact, the health and quality of life of Africans, young people particularly, are also part of the Agenda 2063 and of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Also, a future of the youth will be that we are most likely to see more zoonotic diseases. Now, these diseases are, in other words, where organisms can move between humans and animals. We've seen that, for example, with Ebola, with Zika, and now also with coronavirus, where these diseases seem to be more and more developing, and this is part of the International Atomic Energy Agency's efforts, is by using nuclear-derived technology to be able to prevent these kinds of diseases in future. If we can move on, Jarek, I can take also the opportunity to mention that the role of the youth in nuclear energy and nuclear energy development in the peaceful use of nuclear is also globally recognized. In 2019, the International Atomic Energy Agency hosted an event, Youth in Nuclear, engaging the next generation of leaders, with the aim to explore the potential contributions of young people to achieve the socioeconomic benefits of nuclear science and technology through youth engagement, the opportunity and challenges also of young people face in embracing careers and employment related in the field. And in fact, this past week, there has been an announcement regarding the development, or at least a youth in nuclear competition that has been won by a Tanzanian living and studying in Ghana, for example. So there are continental efforts also to include the youth in nuclear and promoting the study of nuclear sciences, but also raising awareness of nuclear energy and its potential benefits, but also raising the awareness of the dangers that lurk when nuclear energy is used for uses other than peaceful. uses. If we can move on, Yarick. Nuclear concerns that affect the youth today remains that there are states that remain heavily armed in terms of nuclear weapons. For example, the United Kingdom, the US, Russia, China, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel remain states that are heavily armed, that are at various stages of developing their nuclear power capacity, but also in terms of modernizing their arsenals. There are also states that are considering the weaponization, the nuclear weaponization of space, that is, of course, a major concern. Then the nuclear arms race continues. Iran, we know, has been expressing its wishes to develop a nuclear weapons capability. Some good news on this front has been that the agreements or the talks on the Iranian nuclear weapons program has resumed this past week in Vienna under the Joint Comprehensive Peace Agreement, Plan of Action, but it remains a work in process. I've mentioned the continuous modernization of nuclear arsenals and also the effect of the use of nuclear capabilities by non-state armed groups, for example. The African Union is on record of expressing its concern of nuclear capabilities falling in the hand of non-state actors. Yarick, you are welcome to take on here.
Yonsi, maybe you just want to take participants through the last slide since you started speaking about modernization of nuclear arsenals, and then I'll take over from the next one.
I'd be happy to do that. Thank you, Yarick. So currently, the nuclear warheads, the latest counts are globally 13,400. Now, this is a significant reduction from what we've seen during the Cold War. But despite these, there are still 6,375 in the hands of Russia, 5,800 in the hands of the US. And their need goes down, but in terms of the countries that I've mentioned. These remain, most of them are in storage, but a large number of these nuclear wars are still on an alert number. We know, for example, that countries like North Korea, Israel, India, and Pakistan are, for example, outside the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which make it more difficult to control these countries by overseeing their nuclear weapons development, whereas the nuclear weapon states, Russia, US, France, China, and the UK, are within the NPT. Now, this is where the problem arises. Even though these states are within the NPT, they are not necessarily adhering to the NPT. And the Article 4 that Yarick referred to remains very contentious. The nuclear armed state says that we will disarm, but then Article 4 is no longer applicable. In other words, the peaceful use of nuclear energy, whereas the Global South or the non-aligned movement countries that are also parties to the NPT say, we want to use nuclear weapons or nuclear energy for the peaceful use to improve human development. So there is this grand bargain that has been struck that remains very contentious. The NPT Review Conference is striving to achieve global nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and then to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. This conference could not take place last year due to the COVID pandemic. It is likely to take place this year in August, and it will then also raise the question of the Middle East WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone, which for us as Africans is a very important point of discussion. Egypt is regarded as part of the Middle East. Egypt is also a member of the Arab League, for example. Egypt is also an African state that has not signed onto the Pelindaba Treaty and remains, of course, a country that is very influential in the African context, a member of the African Union that is playing an important role. Egypt says that it remains a contentious issue, as Israel is a nuclear weapon state that is outside the NPT. Let me leave you with these thoughts. Jarek, if you can please conclude for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yes, let me conclude and also share some of our research findings. Obviously, like we mentioned earlier, you're looking at 17 countries in Africa that are either expanding or developing their nuclear programs. And we've mentioned some of the challenges, concerns. So how to go about it the right way. And through our research, we've identified Ghana as a best practice for approaching a nuclear program in a safe and responsible manner. So Ghana is currently planning to build a nuclear power plant over the next decade by 2030. And it's already started talks with some external partners, including China, Republic of Korea, that's South Korea, and Russia for financial assistance, because it looks like the costs will be $8 to $10 billion. So far, they're being very transparent about it, the costs and also who they've approached. And another good example is they're following the milestones approach of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a three-step process that ensures that a country has the necessary legislation, regulations, and infrastructure in place before they proceed to the next step. So they are also working with a global regulatory body to ensure that they do it in a safe and responsible manner. Apart from that, they've also ratified international nuclear agreements, all the key ones, without any reservation about any of the clauses, terms and conditions, so to speak. And they've also joined a key multilateral nuclear organizations. And furthermore, as mentioned, sometimes there is a disconnect between signing and ratifying. So not only Ghana has ratified, they've also domesticated these international agreements to ensure nuclear safety and security, prevent nuclear proliferation, and also responsibly handle the environmental legacy of nuclear power, which is also very important in this context. So that was our last slide. But in case you're interested in the program and the research outputs, we've got quite a few on the webpage. So please visit saya.org.za/thematic area/governance/nuclear governance. You can also just find it on our website using the search function. And we've also launched a advocacy campaign to both promote the safe use of nuclear energy on the continent, but also to warn about some of the dangers. So we've got 4 videos, we've got key campaign messages, and the social media campaign. We welcome everyone's input. So the link for that is below. And also there are 2 youth organizations that we thought we would also link to. The one is the African Young Generation in Nuclear, africanygn.org. And then the other one is the South African Young Nuclear Professional Society, SAYNPS.org. So please feel free to visit them as well. And that's it for myself and Joansi. We always conclude our presentations with a photo from the pre-COVID days when we didn't have to wear masks. We had a physical meeting and no social distancing. So thank you very much for your attention. And it's been a pleasure to inform you today about the role of youth in nuclear.
Thank you, Jarek.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are currently are running over time, and we ask everyone to invite everyone to remain in the session for a bit longer. We are running over time by 10 minutes. So without wasting any more time, we are going to move on to our next speaker, who is Mr. Seth Muli from Youth Bridge Trust, who will be speaking on education, employment, and entrepreneurship.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Maleng for the introduction. Good afternoon to the esteemed panelists and all the attendees. I know I am the person that's in between you and lunch, so I'm going to keep it nice and short. If the previous speaker could just allow me to share my screen by, unless you'd like us to share presentations, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. As Itumeleng mentioned, I have the honor of leading the Youth Bridge Trust, the executive director, and today I'll be just chatting through what we've been doing in the education, employment, and entrepreneurial space. I'm going to highlight a bit around what we do as an organization and then share further points. So I think today the outline of discussions is just looking at the challenges and opportunities that youth face on the continent, and previous panelists have already expressed a lot of those sentiments, but I'll briefly share on that, talk about Youth Bridge Trust, impact on the continent, and the way that we do things. So as we look at the African continent, many panelists have mentioned that Africa is and will become the youngest continent in the next few years. But as we look at the challenges that young people face, is the lack of adequate and equal job creation, high levels of unemployment, limited access to further education, and increased number of students leaving the formal educational space before completing some form of qualification or high school, even in the pre-primary stages. So Youth Bridge Trust was birthed out of that idea of trying to help educate and employ young people through various initiatives. Now, our focus is primarily to build Africa's future, and how we do that is by empowering youth to fulfill their full potential. It's no longer the future of work, it's now the way of work, which we believe will shift Africa to a prosperous future. And how we do that is by providing financial resources to organizations that are implementing innovative youth employment, education, and entrepreneurial programs on the continent. We then provide capacity building support to these organizations. And then through our knowledge platform, we share research, thought leadership to kind of help the youth development practitioners understand best practice, but also help connect them. So in partnership with Google for Nonprofits, we launched a digital platform to map out youth serving organizations on the continent. And to date, we have about 2,000 plus organizations that are interacting with one another, sharing best practices. And at a later stage, I'll share the link so that you can utilize it. In terms of how we fund these projects, and what these projects do is training of youth in various skills. So there's life skills, workplace skills, entrepreneurial skills, there's agricultural training skills. And then those implementing agents then support those young people to find some form of employment, link them to some form of business support, and some form of further educational training. Our geographic footprint currently is in Namibia and South Africa. We are just about to go into Rwanda and a couple of other Southern African nations. And here we work with implementing agents. So these are community-based organizations, youth serving entities that are really on the ground. Particularly in Namibia, we work in rural areas, helping young women start up entrepreneurial ventures, particularly in the agricultural space. And we have some fascinating insights that we've developed through that partnership in Namibia. Just to highlight some of the inclusion of young people on the continent, in terms of the programs that we funded over the last few years, 69% of participants have been women and 31% have been men. And then just to highlight very briefly impact of some of these programs, 5,000 young people have gone through some form of skilling program, 1,500 continued their education, 2,000 were placed in jobs, and 150 started their businesses. And now we're trying to, let me go back to the slide, we're trying to help the business owners go from early stage to access further funding through various funding institutions that are not of our own, that can help them accelerate those businesses. Now, in terms of our organization, we serve implementing agents, we serve the young people themselves, and especially the NEET, not in education, employment, or training. Particularly in Southern Africa, we have a large majority of young people that are in that category, and we seek to serve that community through the resourcing of these entities that support these young people. So over the last few years, we've invested $4 million, and this report was in 2019, just before COVID. Thereafter COVID, we've invested further resources across the continent, particularly in Southern Africa, to various organizations. In Namibia, we focus primarily on helping young people. As you probably know, through the APRM report, youth unemployment in Namibia is at 50%. And so there we help young people to become entrepreneurs, particularly in the agricultural space. But we also work with young people to assist them in setting up early childhood development centers, as Namibia has highlighted the early childhood development sector as a key area for development in that country. So our focus is really to go into a country and support local entities that are working on youth employment, youth entrepreneurship, and youth education, and support them, and not necessarily impose our programs, but partner with them to help them understand what is necessary in terms of the different sectors, and then provide support in terms of monetary and capacity development. Now, as we look into the way of work, I don't want to call it the future of work, we've also positioned ourselves to try and ensure that we fund organizations that are working on these future work skill categories, this work readiness, soft skills, technical skills training, and entrepreneurship. I always throw this slide so that everyone is aware of what are these future work skill categories. This was published from the World Economic Forum, and we use it as a basis in our funding MOUs. Now, as we look at the future of work, last year, Microsoft issued a report around the 10 jobs that have the highest number of job openings and have a steady growth over the next 4 years, that pay a livable wage and require skills that can be learned online. And we're not saying that every young person should go into these skilled categories, but we're saying that there are a lot of opportunities in the ITC sector to help educate and employ young people. I think what we need to do is catalyze a lot of these opportunities for young people on the continent to access these opportunities. And as we look at the continent, in some of the areas that we work with, young people don't have access to electricity. So even helping them understand some of these skills of the future, we need to work backwards and ensure that infrastructure is in place before we can already skill them in these new employment opportunities. I'll stop there and briefly just share on actions around education, employment, and entrepreneurship that we've just noted. I think in working with the African Peer Review Mechanism, this year we launched a joint conference called the African Youth Economic Forum, where we had over 1,000 participants from 45 different countries participate. And we're engaging with issues that related to the development of the continent and how young people could become actors in the space of ensuring that the economic development of the continent is primarily led by youth, as we are the future of this continent. A lot of key issues that came out from that forum was governance. Governance is a major issue for young people, particularly when it comes to ensuring that the right policies are in place to help young people. If we just look at education, I think we need to ensure that the governance, the policies that are implemented on a continental level regarding education are positioned well to ensure that young people have access to quality education at an affordable rate. If we look at entrepreneurship and looking at how Singapore has put policies for young people to access government grants to start their own enterprises, we need to look at how we can fast track policies of that nature on the African continent to ensure that young people can access entrepreneurial opportunities, policies that relate to tax rebates for young enterprises. These are the issues that were debated at the African Youth Economic Forum. Then if we look at employment, we're not saying, and through what we've done at the Youth Bridge Trust, we know that every young person has a pathway to success. We're not saying that every young person should become an entrepreneur. We're not saying that every young person should further their education. And we're not saying that every young person should find some form of employment, but what we want to create is a pathway to success such that we ensure that every young person has an opportunity based on their skill set, based on their aspirations to find some form of employment, or if they do not want to become employed, start their entrepreneurial venture. And if they don't want to do entrepreneurship or employment, further their education. But this all comes down to governance and ensuring that we have the right policies that support development practitioners who are working on the ground. In closing, I think I'd like to commend the APRM, SIA, for the great work that they've done in presenting these reports, because it validates some of the decisions that we're making at a funding level. Especially around youth engagement when it comes to policy development, but also the development practitioners that are on the ground who are working towards achieving, working towards ensuring that young people have some form of skills-based employment. And I just want to touch on employment. I think we need to shift the conversation away from degree-level education to more TVET college skills training. I think on the continent, if we can equip young people with artisan skills, that's also another opportunity to ensure that young people have access to, one, employment in the skills trade, but also they can start their own entrepreneurial ventures. We've done this in Namibia with great success in helping young people set up cooperatives based on particular skill sets that we were able to help them ascertain in bricklaying, mechanical workers. And so I think that's also another area in which we can accelerate employment on the continent through skills building, particularly in the artisan skills training. And I think my time has come to an end. I'd just like to thank everyone for the great insights that we've shared. I'll share a link. We've also published research reports around helping young people access agriculture. I don't have time to go into it, but we've noted that in previous generations, agriculture has not been positioned very well for young people as an attractive choice of either employment or entrepreneurial venture. And with new partners that we've come on board with, we are working on ensuring that we help young people understand that there are innovative approaches to agriculture, such as hydroponics and aquaponics. And we're launching a program here in South Africa to equip young people with skills to set up hydroponic and aquaponic businesses in their local township communities. So thank you to Maleng and esteemed panelists.
Thank you very much, Seth. We are now going to move on to our last speaker for session 2, who is Ms. Tessa Dooms from Tesoro Consulting. She will be speaking on intergenerational engagement and co-leadership. And while Tessa speaks, I ask everyone who has any questions or comments to please pose those on the question and answer section or on the chat function so that we can swiftly move into our dialogue and question and answer session after Tessa has spoken.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's been quite a long morning already, and there's been a lot of information. And so what I'm hoping to do is not talk about the facts and figures, because they've been laid out for us very, very well this morning, but to just give us a sense of how young people practically become the leaders of our society. And so I'm going to make my main point as my first point, which is essentially that I'm coming here to speak not on behalf of young people. I'm coming here to speak on behalf of old people and to old people, to say that old people need to be ready to be led by young people today. that the main point I want to make today is that older people need to be ready to be led by youth today. So how do I get to that point, and why do I think that that's an important message for us to think about? The first thing is that, as we've seen today, youth issues are not a small segment or some specialized set of issues. All issues are youth issues. Today we spoke about nuclear energy as a youth issue, because in a continent like ours, in a continent like Africa, where you have the majority of people, over 66%, below the age of 35, and that includes children, because we're thinking about the next 10 years, people who we don't consider youth right now will enter into the youth category. We need to recognize that the majority of our continent are youth or younger or will be youth soon, and therefore every issue is a youth issue. And that means that young people need to be involved in every aspect of our society and of our lives. If we don't see young people as integral parts of our development journey as a continent, we will be losing out on this demographic dividend that we so easily speak about. The second reason why this is important is because often when we talk about the demographic dividend, we're talking about leveraging young people as tools, utilizing them, putting them into employment so they can work the system, putting them into spaces where they can work for society. And I believe that we have to think about leveraging the demographic dividend beyond how young people are instrumental to the system, but also how young people can shape and lead our societies. And this is not a foreign concept in Africa. If we look at the people leading our continent today and who've led our continent in the last 10 to 20 years, many of our leaders started their leadership journeys leading their societies, leading their communities, and even their countries when they were youth, when they were in their 20s, when they were at least or at most in their 30s. We actually have a strong history in the continent of young people leading change, leading revolution, leading the way in which our society and the direction it needs to go. The problem is that they did not see that they needed to make space for future generations of young people. There's been a culture of saying, well, when the people who are leading now were young, youth needed to lead. And now that they're old, experience is important. And we need to challenge those narratives. We need to see the value and the unique benefits that younger generations bring into our society. And we need to figure out how we harness them, not just for utility, but for leadership. And then the final reason why this is important is because youth are the primary experts on youth. In a continent filled with young people, if we want to understand the circumstances, the life chances, the aspirations of young people, we need to be willing to have young people be the experts themselves. I was asked to participate in a book writing project last year on youth. And I ended up boycotting the project because it didn't seem important to people that the people writing in the book were actually young people themselves. It didn't seem important to people that the voices in the room were young people that were conceptualizing the book about youth experiences were young people. And the argument made was, well, the people who are researching, the experts in this field, the people who have the credibility that's going to make this book sell, are unfortunately not youth. And that's not accidental. It's not accidental that young people are not growing in scholarship and able to present their perspectives as youth. There's a lot of things that we've seen already today that are blocking young people from being able to become scholars and speak on their own behalf. But also what we think about as an expert. For me, what I've learned as a youth practitioner is that the greatest expertise are not people who are going to make it into the halls of academia. They're people who are living the youth experience every single day. And it's not enough to just collect their stories and then tell it on their behalf. We have to give them space to talk about their stories in their own words, and more importantly, to change their stories into opportunities for change in society, into new ways of thinking, into new ideas. And so for me, I want to share two things that I think needs to happen. The one is that we do need this idea of intergenerational co-leadership to take root. And like Luanda said earlier, we have gotten too comfortable with creating youth-only spaces where young people are seen as some kind of marginal group who need a little space where they can be by themselves. I call it the children's table of society. We need to move away from the children's table, and we need to make sure that young people are at tables of leadership. Why do I say that? Number one, representation matters. If we keep on identifying and saying that we have a young continent, then its leaders must represent and reflect its demographic. Representation matters in a democracy because in a democracy, when you say the people shall govern, we want to entrust our vote, we want to entrust our ideas, we want to entrust our power to people who we know are like us and see things from our perspective. And so representation matters, and young people need to be at the table for that. The second is innovation. Younger people have to think about things in different ways because their circumstances are different. The circumstance of each generation is different. We know the Frantz Fanon quote that says every generation must from time to time find its mission and fulfill it. That's because each generation comes into a slightly different set of circumstances, sometimes a dramatically different set of circumstances, and see things differently. And I know we get told that experience is important, and that's why co-leadership is there, because you want that balance of experience and zeal and innovation. But sometimes experience is also bad. There are people who had 50 years of bad experience as leaders. They've garnered bad ways of doing things, or things that were working 10 years ago or 20 years ago that no longer work now, that are regressive. And so bringing in young people at those leadership levels challenges those organizational cultures that no longer work, but also helps us identify things that we thought were good for us, but were actually bad. Young people are prone to innovation because their circumstances are always slightly different from generation to generation. And then the final thing about why co-leadership is important is that young people have skin in the game. We talk about Agenda 2063. I am old enough to know that in 2063, I am not going to be of use to this continent. And I don't intend to have children, so it even gets worse for me because I don't even have the kind of generational foresight talking about my children and their children. But people who are 15 today are going to be in the heartbeat of this continent and our countries when Agenda 2063 needs to be fully realized and along that journey. So we need to be thinking about how you bring people in as young as possible, children as well. We're talking about youth today, but children as well, because they have skin in the game. They're not thinking about the fact that they're going to be dead or decrepit in 10 years or in 20 years' time. They're thinking about the fact that in 10 years or 20 years' time, they're going to be in the prime of their lives and they're going to be raising the next generation. They have skin in the game that older generations don't, and we need to see that as an asset. And then the final three things I want to say is to older generations. I'm 37, I'm no longer youth, and I actually contend that I haven't been youth for a long time. The age of youth up to 35 is a nominal phenomenon. It is not something that has merit and substance because we don't actually think about what it means to transition out of youth. And we need to start being clear about the youth development journey and what success looks like. When does somebody exit youth? It can't be based on age. It needs to be based on a developmental journey. And I feel for myself, in terms of the developmental markers that I've set, I probably stopped being youth in my late 20s. I probably started moving into a phase where I didn't need as much support from the state and other parts of society in order for me to be a functional and contributing member of society. Youth needs to be about getting people to that phase as quickly as possible. But while people are youth, there are three things that as older generations, we need to start doing. Number one is making space for young people. This idea that young people have to fight for space at the table is absolutely ridiculous. We are going to continue perpetuating cycles that say, because I fought and because I struggled, a young person must fight for their seat and they must struggle. As if we don't gain benefit from the insights and the views that young people bring to the table. Young people should not have to fight for the seat at the table. We need to create active space. And if that means us moving aside, sacrificing our own opportunities to lead, then that's what we need to do. I intend to be part of the generation that sacrifices my opportunity to lead my country or my continent if it means that there's a 25-year-old who can do it just as well or better. Then the second thing is that we need to be willing to be led by young people. And again, I've said it now and I'll say it again. I look forward to the day that I put my ex next to on a ballot, somebody who is 10 or 20 years younger than I am. I look forward to the day where I walk into a company and my CEO is 10 or 20 years younger than I am. Because as we grow older, we need to make ourselves available with our skills and our experience and all of those things. We need to make ourselves available to young people and be willing to be led by them, as opposed to constantly fighting to be at the front. I said to a group of older veteran type people a few months ago, that the reason why young people are not joining up with even good causes that are started by older people is because older people are reluctant to join in with young people when young people have something to fight for. And so I encourage older people to look for every opportunity to be led by a young person, to see their ideas, to validate it, and to be participants as followers in what young people are trying to do. And then the final thing that older people can do with much more clarity and certainty is provide your social capital and your resources and your networks to young people. Lend young people support, not only in word, not only in space, but in terms of the resources that are needed, in terms of the social capital that we get. Because at the end of the day, we will lose out if we have a next generation of young people who lag behind. Our society as a whole loses out. And in South Africa today, we're experiencing that. We are seeing these big leadership gaps. We're talking about the missing middle of leadership. We're talking about the missing middle of people who can come to the fore and lead our society, because we have lagged a generation behind. We've kept them behind and outside of leadership for so long. And now we're expecting people in their 40s and their 50s to be able to have the credibility that they should have started having 20 years ago. So we must be willing to provide and give of our social capital to younger people in order not only for them to thrive, but for our societies to be better. So I look forward to having more conversations about how we create real spaces where when you walk into the room, regardless of what the cultural dynamics are, we see each other for what we bring into the room, for our skills, our ability, and our perspectives, rather than just for our age. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Your presentation just made me think of the Zulu statement, which says, "Ligotshwa lisemanzi," meaning that when you train a child, you have to do it as early as possible. And it is the same with youth development and involving young people in issues of public participation and advocacy. The earlier we start, the better. And with Youth at SAYA, for example, the youth programs are aimed as young people, as young as 14 years old. They are part of programs, part of public participation processes and policy engagement. Right now, I am going to just open up for question and answer session. We are running late, so we will just have 2 questions from our participants who are here today. So if you have any question or comment that you would like to say with regards to any of the speakers that we have spoken about, your thoughts on what youth development and advocacy in the 2020s should look like, please raise your hand and you will be recognized and given an opportunity to speak. While we wait for hands to be raised, I will read one question that we have in the question and answer session. Is from Tabiso, who says that, Itumeleng, I am fervently hoping that we are going to be furnished with all these presentations via our emails. Thank you in advance. Yes, all the presentations that have been presented today will be sent to everybody that has registered and attended today's session. I see that we do not have any hands currently raised, and I guess that will bring us to the end of our session. I would like to thank SAIA for organizing the session, and for thanking all of the speakers that have been present today for getting into this discussion, presenting all their research findings on the really pertinent issues that surround young people in the 2020s. I am now going to officially hand over to Luanda, who is going to do our official vote of thanks and closing.
Thank you very, very much, Itumeleng. I'm just going to be brief. I know we have eaten into additional time. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Itumeleng, as the moderator. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that you did a fantastic job in guiding and steering this conversation. I'd like to thank all the panelists who really volunteered their time to really take us through what they think matters for youth in the 2020s. I'd like to thank SAIA Events for helping us put together this event. I'd like to thank our comms team for all the graphics and for live tweeting. I'd like to thank everybody who attended with us and stuck through even though we ran over time. I would like to reassure you that the recording of this event will be sent out, as well as the presentations, and we will develop an event report that will capture everything that was discussed and then send it out to everybody. We're hoping that people can identify areas of mutual synergy, gaps, and work that we can partner in doing, and do reach out to us, and we will certainly be reaching out to others who we've identified immediate linkages. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for participating in this event, and we look forward to having you in further SAIA events. Thank you very much.